question. I also have the dissonance of trying to do a thing in a correct way, but that was just burning me out. So I decided to stop the spiritual goals and just do what I like to do. Now I fear that I will lean too much into the old worldview again. Any advice? Well, this is a question that affects quite a number of spiritual people I've seen over the years. And as I said before, we grow up, most of us have grown up in an environment where there was nothing that nourished our spiritual interests. We were either affected by a traditional religion which denies that there's a spiritual path because they have an instant salvation, or we are affected by scientific materialism which denies there's any kind of spirituality. So at some point we find a spiritual teaching, guru, path, and we realize there's something we can do, there's a process we can undertake to raise our consciousness. And we often feel that this is what I've been longing for all my life, this is what I sensed was there, and it's the most important thing for me, and now that I finally found it, after all of this time, I wasted so much of my life, now I really want to give it my all to the spiritual path. So you go into a specific spiritual movement, they have a particular teaching and practice, so you become very, very diligent, almost obsessive compulsive about this spiritual practice. I did that myself. I've seen thousands of other people do it. Tens of thousands of other people do it. And what happens is that we are driven by this obsessive compulsive need to compensate and to make spiritual progress very quickly, and we think we can do this by doing the outer things. And it is, of course, an unbalanced reaction to begin with. I'm not blaming anybody for it. I think that's why I'm saying we grew up in a certain way, and so we are it's almost inevitable we go into this unbalanced reaction. But I'm just saying that in the long run we need to come and see that it's imbalanced, and we need to find a different balance. So in other words, what I've seen many people do is exactly what the person is describing in the question. You adopt a spiritual teaching, you adopt a spiritual practice, you practice it so much, and you are trying to do all the right things according to the outer teaching, that at a certain point you can't do it anymore. You'll just burn out. Yeah, I've talked about it in another video about spiritual burnout. And there are people who, as a result of this burnout, they have to stop all spiritual practice, all spiritual studies. Some people get really angry and negative and say, oh, the spiritual path was a hoax, because they expected that if they did everything they were told, they would have a breakthrough in X amount of time, and it didn't happen, so now they get mad. But there are also some that just need to put aside spiritual things for a while and focus on some worldly issues. It could be raising children, for example, or making a living, or whatever. But so I've seen many people do this. You first go into one extreme and then you swing to the other extreme. But what I've also seen happens to many people eventually is that now they find a balance. So first they were too eager with their spiritual practice, then they stopped it completely, but now they find some kind of balance where they can study spiritual teachings, do a spiritual practice, and still live a practical everyday life. And as I've said, that is really the challenge in the age of Aquarius, to integrate spirituality with everyday life. And that means that we can't be obsessive compulsive about always practicing this particular spiritual practice and neglecting everything else in our lives. We have to find a way to live a balanced life. But as I said, often that's not something we can do right away. And often it's not something that's encouraged by spiritual movements. This is actually one of the big problems I see in spiritual movements. The most extreme example I've seen of this was the Summit Lighthouse, where the big thing that was done in the Summit Lighthouse was giving these decrees to the Ascended Masters, both for our personal goals and for world conditions. And there were certain decrees you should do every day, and then there were services 4 times a week you could go to, and you could of course do individual decrees also. So there were people who would spend, I don't know, you could easily spend 3 or 4 hours a day doing just what was recommended, and some people probably spent more. So if you spend 3, 4, 5, 6 hours doing a spiritual practice, you have to neglect other aspects of life. I mean, you can't do everything. And then there were rules in the Summit Lighthouse for how you should behave, how you should dress, what colors you should wear, how you should talk, what you should eat, how you should prepare the food, and this and that. So, in other words, I had a point after I came to the headquarters of the Summit Lighthouse in 1987 where I felt like, I literally felt like, all of my life I had known there was something missing in my life. And I came to a point where I realized it was spiritual growth and a spiritual path. And now I had found this organization which I really felt had a very high teaching, and I was determined to give it my all, but I felt like I was in the straitjacket. The image I had at the time was these suits of armor that you see in medieval castles. And because the average person was about 6 inches smaller than the average person today, you can't fit into these. There will just be a tight squeeze around you, and you will feel like you are squeezed from all sides. And that's literally how I felt. Like I was trying to fit into one of these suits of armor. And of course you can't move. Because literally, I mean, if you wanted to do everything right, you couldn't move, you couldn't think, you couldn't, you didn't have a life, basically. And you forced yourself to do all of this because you thought it had some greater purpose. Either both your personal growth and the growth of the world. And I saw the same thing in Transcendental Meditation that I was in. I've seen it in other spiritual movements. So what I'm saying is that a big problem in spiritual movements is that they don't teach people about balance. Because we have to find a balance between everyday practical life and our spiritual pursuits. And it's an individual for each one, of course, but most spiritual movements, they have this, there's like a model for how you're supposed to be if you're a good student in that movement. And it's usually more than anybody can do in a balanced way. And so I think many spiritual people have gone through this, and many spiritual people have found a personal balance. But I think there's still a certain, at least I sense, and I had to struggle with it myself for years, where you feel like if you're not doing everything right, you're just not good enough. You're not a really good student. You're somehow lacking. And there are, of course, people that will encourage that, because there are always people that are trying to do everything and they feel like they are much better than those who are not. But the reality is that finding balance is the highest approach to spirituality, and the more mature spiritual seekers are the ones who find balance, their personal balance, and who say, well, this is who I am, this is what I can do given my practical situation, for example, if you had children, and I'm at peace with that. I'm at peace with doing it. Because, of course, as the questioner says, if you start with a one unbalanced reaction where you're trying to do everything right, then you flip over, now you're not doing anything right, well, that's also an unbalanced view. So you're not growing as much as you could spiritually if you are ignoring any kind of spiritual teaching or practice. And that's why I'm saying a balance between the two. Where you find a spiritual teaching that appeals to you, you study it, you find a spiritual practice that works for you, and you practice it in a balanced way. And then, of course, beyond that, if you really want to grow maximum, you realize that it's so important on the spiritual path to resolve psychology. And that's actually, you could say, the real reason why we need to have balance. Because I look back, I can see it in myself, I can see it in other people. When you are so focused on doing everything right and doing the spiritual practice in an obsessive compulsive way, you don't have time or attention to look at your psychology, because you're always doing this, you always have to do more. And then when you flip to the other extreme, where now you're ignoring spiritual growth, well, you're not really looking at your psychology either. So the balanced approach is that you realize that yes, the spiritual practice is important, but it's just as important to live an everyday life where you interact with other people and you get into situations where you react. And then if you're willing to look at your reactions, as I've said in many videos, they always come from a subconscious self. If you follow the reaction, you can see the self and resolve it, then you make spiritual progress. So there's an interchange between the spiritual practice and everyday life, and your willingness to look at your psychology and your reactions. Even your reactions to a spiritual teaching or teacher or spiritual practice can help you resolve psychology. So if you adopt that approach, then you will, in my view, make maximum spiritual progress. Because I look back and I can see that those years where I was so focused on doing the outer things, I didn't make anywhere near the spiritual progress I thought I was making. And I've made much more progress after I really started looking at the psychology. And of course, when I think back to before I found the spiritual path, I was living a normal life up to my when I was 18 and found the spiritual path. I also wasn't making as much progress. So definitely balance. But it's not just balance between spiritual activities and worldly activities. It's really the balance of seeing everything as an opportunity to resolve psychology.